Joining me now is former Pentagon advisor and member of the US Navy Reserve, Jason Israel. Thanks for your time. It's just interesting, obviously, there's so much talk about the election result and the people, the Trump voters in particular, who don't believe the result. So much was spoken of last time that, Russia was trying to undermine the result. This is critically important for any democracy, that voters believe and accept the result. Is that a security concern now for the US?
Well, I think what you're going to see is, as we've talked about before, Tom, both a domestic and an international audience for such issues, right? So there's a domestic audience. We know how divided voters were in the United States. I mean, 72 million plus people voted for President Trump, and many of them do believe that anything he says. So the fraud in the relationship. So any concern begins with, what did the domestic population believe? Because that could interrupt, our core democratic institution. But externally, we've had concerns both in the last election and this one about foreign interference. And foreign interference doesn't necessarily happen by trying to manipulate ballot boxes. It happens by trying to manipulate opinion. So that can flow directly into supporting some of the Trump narratives, and foreign governments would have an incentive to do that. So definitely a security concern, and something that should be looking at as a trend both now and going forward.
The President-elect, his approach to Australia is obviously on our minds here, but perhaps more relevantly for us right now, Joe Biden's approach to China. We heard or saw some very strong comments on Twitter from his national security advisor. Where does this indicate that the Biden team will land, if you like? Certainly, it's obviously not going to be a China sympathiser, but to what extent do you think they'll be able to be part of a multilateral, look, not a force against China, but ballast, particularly in the region?
Yeah, Tom, I think you're right to include both the relationship with Australia and the relationship with China in the same question. Very briefly on the U.S.-Australia, it's unflappable. And I believe that my view is that over the last 4 years, the U.S.-Australia relationship has become the premier alliance in the world. And I think that if I was staffing the President-elect Biden for his first week in office, that the Prime Minister of Australia would be one of the first calls, if not the first, to really discuss common concerns. So that's first and foremost. Second, when you talk about China in the region and policy, the view I think that might be different when it comes to the Biden administration, because much of it will be the same. There is bipartisan, concern about China and desire to move forward with a strong position of strength with China in the relationship. But I think what might be different is the development of a real alternative for allies in the region. I think that's what's going to be the priority for the president-elect. He's going to spend, and he said this even this week with this interview with Tom Friedman in the New York Times, he's going to spend a lot of time in that first month talking to allies and sort of revamping that relationship between the U.S. And those allies, because I'm recognizing that the China question is much more about the U.S. relationship with allies in the region. And again, Australia will be first and foremost. And then in details, things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, will that come back on the table as an economic agreement? Those are things we'll look out for. But I do believe that the focus will be on the creating an alternative for allies in the region, and also, as he said, investment at home to compete with China, not just militarily security in the region, but also by investing in science and technology heavily. And the Trump administration did begin with that. This year, they began a $1 billion investment in several advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence. And I think that the president-elect will continue with that.
Well, the first call would be a big one. We'll see where we rank on the overall number. Perhaps you can use your influence to get us up the chain there, Jason.
No influence, but I'll put my money down that it's the first one.
Your money, okay, all right, very bold. That is an interesting prediction. We will follow that. Afghanistan government and Taliban peace talks, significant as to just how difficult these have been, that it is described as a breakthrough, that they've just got at least an agreement on a set of rules and procedures here now.
Yes, I think the only thing keeping this headline, that the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan have written their first agreement in 2 decades. I mean, this is big news. If it included a ceasefire, I think this would be the front page news of the day right now. But what this actually is, it's a written agreement, 3 pages, that actually commits to talks. And that is a major step forward, because talks have been, first of all, resisted by the Taliban for 10 plus years. And during the entire Trump administration up until now. But in Qatar, it shows that they've come to the table and said that they're going to commit to talks over the next year, and that could include a ceasefire. That is a major step forward when it comes to the future of Afghanistan, and even the possibility that that the U.S. troops and other allies will be able to withdraw their troops. Now, on the con side here, there is always a concern that groups like the Taliban could instigate violence and then deny that it was them, that they could fund other violent groups, and that's always a concern. But the goal would be to make that something that could be more transparent and move toward a peaceful resolution. So a big step forward here and something to look out for.
It's out of the headlines now mostly, but gee, 2 decades. It's incredible to reflect on just the quagmire that is. Interesting development in China, though. So they've closed public consultation on a new law. It would allow the Coast Guard increased authority to protect its claimed sovereignty in disputed areas. We're talking here the South China Sea. This sounds a significant move and could lead to more flashpoints.
Yes, Tom, we talk a lot about the gray zone, about how China just slowly puts forward small policies or small moves that stay out of the headlines and prevent a violent response. This is a great example of it. You might remember that earlier this year, we covered China having this small, changing a few words in its domestic policy and claiming that some of these waters were actually inland waters and not offshore waters. And so those are significant. In this case, the largest coast guard in the world, China, if this law passes, will now have the authority to use armed force in order to enforce its territorial areas, which effectively turns the largest coast guard in the world into part of the Navy, and changes its role. So it's something to note. As it's patrolling these reefs that it claims credit for, it can use violent action to destroy facilities that another country might have put on. And so something to look out for is that it's trying to that China's trying to move that that sort of in that gray zone further ahead.
So, I mean, it's the cloak of the Coast Guard, but what you're essentially saying is this just becomes another arm of the military.
With that, if you think that armed force is sort of designed for the military, then yes, the Coast Guard with these authorities would be able to patrol and also enforce through armed action, these laws. So yes, effectively.
Just very briefly, the assassination of the Iranian scientist that headed up the country's nuclear program, getting a lot of headlines. Does this push Iran towards possibly another deal with Joe Biden, or does it create so much ill will that they think, well, we're going to need something else, some sort of incentive to come back to the negotiation table?
Well, absolutely. The negotiation table for the Iran nuclear deal is going to be a very interesting one, and we're going to find out in the first couple months whether Vice President Biden is going to openly go right back into the nuclear deal if Iran reduces the amount of uranium that it has. But the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the chief Iranian, one of the chief Iranian scientists of the nuclear program last week, shows that there's also going to be a powerful domestic force within Iran, a nationalist force that will want to respond to that. And any response that Iran has, once they determine who it was and if they respond, will complicate the U.S. because it could be an ally that was responsible for it. And if that's the case, it's going to complicate the U.S. being able to go to the table without recognizing the effect that it has on their allies. So certainly it makes it more complicated. And whether it actually steps back practically the nuclear program for Iran is another question to be seen.
Jason Rizal, always good to get your thoughts on a Friday. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Have a good weekend.